As the Battle of Gettysburg was raging in early July of 1863, a historic thing happened in Waverly. The first 3 recruits from Colored Hill left their families and journeyed down to Philadelphia to enlist in the brand new United States Colored Troops, known as the USCT. The young trio, John Sampson and brothers Joshua and Peter Norris, signed up for the very first regiment to be trained at the blacks-only boot camp that had just opened outside Philadelphia. Their regiment, the 3rd USCT, 1,000 strong, would be addressed by Frederick Douglass himself soon before the raw recruits were shipped south into the war zone. It had been a long journey politically to get to that point. 2 years earlier, when the Civil War broke out, no black man was allowed to join the federal military. The very notion was dismissed as lunacy, based on a racist fear that blacks in uniform would be both undisciplined and cowardly. Because blacks had no say in the matter of their enlisting, the people on Colored Hill had only been able to watch as the war unfolded. Much of Greater Abington was pro-Lincoln and eager to put down the Southern rebellion by force. White men and youth of the region eagerly enlisted in the beginning for what they were sure would be a glorious victory. But it must be said that not everyone in the region was on board with the Union war effort. The Jacksonian Democrats, who still ruled the region, split pro and con. Some became so-called war Democrats, who allied with Lincoln's Republicans to suppress the rebellion, while others, known as peace Democrats, were willing to appease the South to make peace. The appeasers, known as Copperheads, as shown in the lithograph here, agitated loudly against Lincoln and his crackdown on dissenters, and against what they called his fellow abolition Republicans, or, quote, black Republicans, end quote, and against the president's series of military drafts. The feud, with its competing rallies, slogans, and physical threats, has been called Pennsylvania's, quote, inner civil war, end quote. Hundreds of men resisted the federal draft or deserted in northeastern Pennsylvania. Draft riots and near riots erupted in Scranton, Falls, Carbondale, Blakely, and Pottsville. The home front was a troubled place. By 1863, as the war dragged on and Union troop losses mounted, the need for reinforcements grew. Along with Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation of 1863 came a call for allowing black men in uniform. Many people fought back hard at the notion of quote-unquote black soldiery. One was the area's Democratic Congressman, Hendrick Wright, shown in this old photo. During debate in Congress, Wright declared that, quote, the white Anglo-Saxon race was capable of taking care of itself, but if it had not power to maintain our position, Negroes could not help us out of the difficulty. They were not reliable in military service. Abandon the proposition to bring Negroes into the army, or we are lost, end quote. Enough whites in Congress and the general public felt otherwise by then, however, and the black soldiery proposal passed. Black men immediately began stepping forward to enlist, including 13 with ties to Waverly. The indignities they would face were manifest. No $300 bounty such as white recruits got. Their monthly pay was 1/4 less than whites. Their equipment was often inferior. Their commanders had to be white. And still they volunteered. More than 180,000 black men from both North and South would serve by the end of the war, organized into 160 regiments. Let's look at the experience of the 3rd USCT, which included that first trio from Waverly in its ranks. After a month of hard training at Camp William Penn, shown in the photo here, the regiment received its special regimental standard or flag. Note its proud motto, quote, rather die free men than live to be slaves, end quote. The men were supposed to parade through central Philadelphia on their way to the wharf to ship out, but that was canceled for fear the sight would provoke a riot by hostile whites. So the men were detoured directly to the river and steamed away. The 3rd USCT was sent to the coast of South Carolina to join the ongoing siege of the Confederate port city of Charleston. The men expected to be in the fighting ranks, but found themselves assigned to lowly duty, unloading supplies and digging fortifications and trenches. Some of the whites even treated them like servants until the generals ordered that behavior to stop. Their nighttime trench digging was dangerous as well as backbreaking. The assignment was to tunnel forward into no man's land toward the rebels' Fort Wagner. They dug through booby-trapped sand while under fire from snipers and cannons, as depicted in the rather sanitized drawing of the time here. The 3rd Regiment lost 6 men dead and a dozen wounded in the perilous operation. As one of their comrades said, quote, "In those trenches our men distinguished themselves for bravery and coolness, which required more nerve than the exciting bayonet charge." End quote. The Confederates soon abandoned Fort Wagner, and the Union intensified its siege of Charleston. As the rebels continued to bombard them with artillery from other forts around the harbor. During this period, the Norris brothers of Waverly sustained injuries that would trouble them for the rest of their lives. A shell burst buried Joshua in the sand and wrenched his back, while Peter sustained a hernia while dragging an enormous cannon up the beach. John Sampson, meanwhile, was sent to work at a nearby military hospital in the segregated second-rate ward for black soldiers. In early 1864, the 3rd USCT was transferred down to Florida near Jacksonville, where it spent the remainder of the war. Groups of the soldiers went out on numerous raiding parties to destroy rebel property and liberate slaves from behind enemy lines. During one of those surprise midnight raids on a rebel camp, one of Peter Norris's mates recalled, quote, "We had the pleasure of liberating some of our flesh and blood. There were about 200 slaves at that place." End quote. One can imagine how powerful it must have been for the Norris brothers, themselves the sons of slaves, to be able to directly set their people free, hundreds of them, and hear their stories of bondage. The regiment remained in Florida even after the war ended to serve as an occupying force. Their job was to keep the peace and protect Southern blacks from mistreatment. The soldiers were a restless lot by then, and stories are told of how they met the scorn of white Southerners with equal scorn. By the time they returned north, they had missed taking part in the enormous parade of victorious Union troops through Washington, D.C., known as the Grand Procession. In fact, no black troops were included in that official national celebration. The black community of Harrisburg did organize a parade for black troops a few months later, and some soldiers from the 3rd were able to join. The Waverly Trio might have been included, which would have been nice because Waverly itself offered no pomp or parade for its returning soldiers, black or white. And what happened to the returning vets of the 3rd? John Sampson moved back to Colored Hill but died young. Peter Norris moved about the region restlessly until settling in Montrose, beset with ailments but active in his church. Brother Joshua became a traveling pastor, stationed across western Pennsylvania until he died nearly deaf from a war injury. They were stoic men in a stoic time.